afternoon. I'm Commissioner Fogarty, and I'm here to preside over the issues relating to the discrimination in educational settings. With me this afternoon is Commissioner Eberhardt, who will be assisting. And this afternoon, we're joined by Lyle Woodham, Regional Director for Pittsburgh with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and Babudi Aryal, did I pronounce your name right?
Very good.
Great. Chair of the Education Working Group with the Pennsylvania Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs. Although the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations doesn't have jurisdiction over matters related to unfair treatment in educational settings, we feel it is important for members of the audience, as well as the general public, to know what resources are available to remedy these types of problems. Each speaker will have approximately 10 minutes to speak. Since we're starting at 2:15, we will finish at 2:45, 50. Anyway, 25 minutes. I'll be the timekeeper, and I'll be letting you know when your time is almost up. Okay. So I'd like to start with Mr. Wood. Can you please tell us about the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission jurisdiction, in particular matters related to education?
Good afternoon. As stated, my name is Lyle Woodham. I'm the Regional Director of the Pittsburgh office of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. The Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission enforces the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act and the Pennsylvania Equal Education Opportunities Act. On or about October 27th, 1955, the General Assembly promulgated the Act, both acts, which basically states that it is illegal and unlawful in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to discriminate against individuals because of their race, their gender, their color, their national origin, their ancestry, their age, their familial status, their disability, which would include the use or support of guide or support animals, or having a GED. The General Assembly, in their wisdom, at that time, and if you could think of the times, 1955 was not necessarily the best period in terms of civil rights. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the best period in terms of equal opportunity in this country. Jim Crow was still running pretty rampant, and it was the law of the land here in the United States. The General Assembly, after a lot of deliberation and after a lot of study, and a lot of testimony, decided that the practice or policy of discrimination foments domestic strife, unrest, threatens the rights and privileges of the inhabitants of the Commonwealth, and undermines the foundation of a free, democratic state. It's very important. Undermines the foundations of a free and democratic state. As a result, the Human Relations Act and the Fair Educational Opportunities Act was passed. Under the Act, and our jurisdiction, there's several jurisdictions that we talk about in the Commission. The Pittsburgh Regional Office's geographical jurisdiction happens to be 26 counties within this approximate third of the state. There's a Harrisburg Regional Office. I believe their jurisdiction is 36 counties within the middle portion of the state, and the Philadelphia Regional Offices, and I think that they have about maybe 6 pretty good sized counties in that eastern part of the state that they have jurisdiction over. The areas under jurisdiction in terms of coverage of the Act would be employment, housing, education, public accommodations, and commercial property. That's a pretty big slice of this life that people have an absolute right to engage in and enjoy. Employment, of course, is probably the largest number of cases that we tend to look at and that we tend to investigate under the Commission's auspices. Housing is probably the second largest, and that's really important because the next jurisdiction sometimes directly correlates with the housing, education. Many times where you live determines where your children go to school. Right. It determines, where you're employed. It determines, in many instances, the quality of life and the standard of living that you could enjoy. Determines whether or not the neighborhood you live in is a more privileged neighborhood or an underprivileged neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Many things revolve around this, and because of that, what we do, and what the City of Pittsburgh Commission does also, and I have to say that our forefathers or progenitors must have been on the same page, because the City of Pittsburgh Act has been in existence since 1955 also. We like to laugh and say the feds were behind the curve. We were ahead of the curve. Their acts, many of their acts did not, especially in housing and equal opportunity, did not take place until closer to 1968. We are, for lack of a better way to put it, the discrimination police for the City of Pittsburgh and the Commonwealth. In terms of the education provisions, education is a little different in that each area has its own particular area of remedy for any acts that take place. Acts of harm under education, which we consider a public accommodation, could be harassment, disparate discipline, disparate grades, failure to permit participation in sports, failure to provide appropriate ESL, English as a second language, instruction and services. The remedies that we look at, and the remedies that, for example, a few of the remedies, and the remedies are case by case. One case may be sufficiently egregious enough so that you have a pretty good adjudication of those violations of the Act. It could be to take measures to stop the current or future harassment, cease and desist, to rescind discipline, to provide appropriate English as second language instruction, personnel or resources, to provide training, to create or modify policy and procedures. And this is important. What we're seeing more of are issues with regards to English as a second language in the schools. With an increased population, immigrant population in our schools, that's important because, again, how can a child learn and be successful and succeed without that additional support, language support? It's pretty tough. I had the opportunity when I'm a Pitt alum, years ago, and having participated in a Fulbright program one summer, this is through the University of Kabul in Afghanistan. It was a long time ago. And so one of the things that we had to do before we left is to actually pass the language course before we went out of the country. We got there, and it was an additional 100 hours, and that was okay. But it's like anything else. Unless you immerse yourself in something, unless you have the right supports, you say, okay, fine, then you go out and have a good time that evening with your friends. My language proficiency didn't begin until the family that I was with said, we don't like the way that you're learning the language. They all spoke fluent English. And for about a month, they stopped speaking English to me. Unless I was going to get ready to sit on a scorpion or something, they were not going to speak English to me, and that's how I learned. And it's the same thing here, but I had that support and that backup kind of in a real skewed way. And same thing with the students here. The students are competent. They are eager to learn. They wish to succeed and be successful. But without those supports, it's like anything else. You can either program an individual to succeed or program them to fail. And the schools have an obligation to essentially provide that assistance. We're finding that in many instances post-election, we're getting more reports of harassment and bullying within the schools. And that is also a problem. The harassment could take any kind of forms. It could be actual physical intimidation. It could be taunting. It could be teasing or bullying. And we will take those complaints. If an individual feels as if they've been discriminated against because of their membership in one of those protected classes that I had mentioned previously, they can file a complaint with the commission. Once a complaint is filed and docketed, that case will be assigned to an investigator. The complaint itself is a legal pleading, a legal fact pleading. It is served on both parties, respondent and complainant parties, in a more of a legal sense. You would call them defendants and plaintiffs. And once they receive the services of the complaint, our investigations begin. Essentially, it is not voluntary at that point. Although we say some parts are voluntary, the statute specifically details our actions, and the Act specifically details our actions. That respondent will have essentially 30 days to provide a written verified answer that it is sufficient to answer each variant of the complaint. If they don't, we have the ability to force an answer or to find probable cause because that individual or that entity, that school district, that individual, that corporation has failed to avail themselves of a defense. And then we're only talking about damages at that point. We will move ahead. We can secure data, records, and documents. If the individuals, respondents do not provide that information, we could subpoena that information. So we have that power. If we find that there is insufficient evidence to support the allegation, then at that point in time, we can issue a finding of no probable cause. If in fact we find sufficient evidence to support the allegation, we'll issue a finding of probable cause and enter into a formal conciliation to remedy that act of harm and to make that individual whole. If we are unsuccessful with that, then we will prosecute that case and adjudicate it and move to a full public hearing where a final determination will be made and appropriate remedy will be sought. So the one thing, and I wish I had more time, but I promise, brevity is not one of my gifts, trust me. Anybody who's heard me knows that about me. So I'm going to stop right there. If you have any questions, I think there may be some follow-up, or you can always contact me at the Pittsburgh office of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Wood, and you did get a lot of information in that very short period of time.
I talk
Thank you very much.
Commissioner Ariel, what can you tell us about the efforts from the Pennsylvania Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs, efforts to minimize instances of unfair treatment in educational settings?
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll try my best to, summarize what our commission does, and then the work around education. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Terrell, and I've had the great pleasure of serving on Governor Wolf's Advisory Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs, very long name, and where I chair the Schools That Teach Committee. The mission of the commission is to ensure that state government is accountable and accessible for the diverse AAPI community. And within that, the Schools That Teach committee is focused on efforts around anti-bullying, ensuring language access for students and parents, and advocating for a more inclusive and diverse curriculum. In light of the increase in ethnic intimidation and harassment, the committee and the commission has placed a great emphasis on civil rights and protecting the diverse communities. So over the last year, what the commission has done is gone out to the different parts of the state to understand what each of the region is seeing in terms of issues, and really hear from them as opposed to come up with remedies without really understanding the situation. Unfortunately, the story is very similar in many parts of the state, as well as the country. There are a couple of different types of discrimination, and I'll talk about each one. The sort of obvious and blatant discrimination is the bullying based on ethnicity, based on religion, based on what you look like. And then there's also the ethnic intimidation and outright violence. We've heard stories of girls that wear hijab, for example, ethnic wear, be physically harassed and on a daily basis. We've heard of students being taunted based on their names, based on their language, based on their ability to speak English as well. We've even heard of stories where teachers openly make anti-Islamic statements in classrooms and allow for bullying of students. I mean, the kids doing it is one thing, but when teachers join in, you know that it's a very serious issue. And unfortunately, these issues are not just limited to immigrant and refugee communities. There's a rise in anti-African American sentiment, anti-Semitic sentiment. We've seen anti-Semitic graffiti in school playgrounds. We've seen anti-African American slurs written in school bathrooms. So the rise in these cases are across the board, and all of our children are suffering. while those cases are very obvious and blatant, we're also concerned about the more subtle form of discrimination, which is the systemic discrimination. And I think Lyle touched on a couple of those points. When you provide a disparate quality of services for ESL students and teachers, frankly, the lack of support for those teachers that are providing education to these students, then you're guaranteeing that they're getting a lower quality service, lower quality education. And Lyle talked about supporting the students in terms of learning the language, but also the parents. Many of the parents that come here from refugee backgrounds or immigrant backgrounds may not have English language access. So when they're not able to communicate with the schools, they feel like they're not part of the school. So we're immediately making many members of our community feel like they're not part of the community. And when parents are not involved in their kids' education, guess what happens? They don't do as well. Mm-hmm. So these are the types of issues that we're trying to address, and other things like lack of bilingual counseling support, which makes such a big difference, especially at a certain age in a student's life, mm-hmm. When they could be making that difference from becoming going down a troubled path or going down a productive path. But unfortunately, issues like language access and culturally sensitive support is missing in many schools. And in these kinds of things, as Lyle pointed out, are not special treatments that these students and parents are asking for. These are civil rights that should be guaranteed to these students. Mm-hmm. So while we certainly want to tackle bullying, ethnic intimidation, absolutely, we also need to tackle these systemic issues. Mm-hmm. And what's been unfortunate, as we've seen throughout the state, is that these issues go very underreported. There are statistics on bullying where in many districts the numbers reported by the Department of Education are 0 in school districts, and we know that is absolutely not the case. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we as a commission are trying to do is ensure that we do a better job of reporting issues, filing complaints, whether it be with Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations or PHRC at the state level. We want to make sure that we are filing these things and reporting issues. But that also brings in why aren't people reporting these things? Mm-hmm. And there are quite a few factors, language access being mm-hmm. one of them there again. But the bigger issue, I believe, is that there's a trust missing between the community, the organizations that are supposed to be protecting the community, and government officials. So when you don't have that trust, why would I bother filing a complaint when I don't believe that you're going to do anything about it? So a hearing like this is great to be able to talk about these issues, but talk alone isn't enough because these children, these parents, these community members are suffering, and we need to provide action. So in order to gain that trust, we need to back all this talk with policy, with funding. We can't use funding as an excuse of not being able to provide civil rights. That's just that's part of the core job of every school, every public accommodation is if you can't meet those needs, then you're going to be taken to court. And that's one of the things that we as a commission are going to be looking at is how can we work with agencies like PHRC and Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations to file complaints, and if it results in a lawsuit of some sort, we are more than willing to make that happen. So along with the policy level work, one of the things that the other things we're trying to do is work at the grassroots level, because if we can make a difference at a school district or a school, and highlighting positive efforts where students-led initiatives or teacher-led initiatives are making a difference for students, we want to highlight those positive things. We want to learn lessons from them so that we can take it and make it broader and hopefully be made available across the school district, across the city, and across the state as well. Betty earlier mentioned the All for All initiative, and I'm proud to be a part of that, and the commission is proud to work along with her and that initiative to bring families, students, community organizations, and academics together to figure out how can we address some of these issues, how can we get funding and resources to support support these families. So I guess in summary, the time for talk is over. It's time for action. But we want to make sure that we work with the agencies that are responsible for policing discrimination issues as we tackle these very serious issues.
Thank you, Commissioner Ariel.
Okay, and I want to thank you both for this, and I think the emphasis on that we need to not be in our silos, but finding ways that we can work together and support each other and learn from each other is really an important one, so thank you for bringing that up too. This overview on impacts in educational settings is over at this time. We hope to hear from the public about this issue during the public comment section, starting at 4:30. We'll adjourn this section now, and we'll lead the next topic, and we're going to the next topic on employment discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you.